Silent Hill. I remember it in my restless dreams. I remember not only when it was good, but when Konami used to give a fuck about producing good video games instead of gambling machines. Yeah, that Konami. Remember Konami? Their upper management was eating good off the proliferation of pachinko for well over a decade. Many gamers, including myself, had written off the company entirely after Hideo Kojima's controversial exit from the company in 2015, but more on that in a minute. Konami decided to focus less on publishing video games once their pachinko machines started earning their shareholders more profit. But by 2020, the company's operating and net income started to shrink. Since then, Konami has returned to video game publishing, outsourcing two big projects for 2024. The bullet hell shoot-'em-up Signy All Guns Blazing, developed by Scottish studio Keelworks, and the much-awaited Silent Hill 2 Remake, developed by Polish studio Bloober Team. Silent Hill released in 1999, 3 years after Resident Evil changed the landscape of video games forever. Survival horror became all the rage in the late 90s. Fixed camera angles, tank controls, and spooky gameplay ushered in an entirely new generation of freaks like me who love the potential of the genre. I rented the game on a whim after getting a whiff of buzz from GamePro magazine hyping up the next potential survival horror cash cow. Resident Evil was hot off their PlayStation 1 trilogy, all survival horror masterpieces. And yet, there was something limited about them. As much as I love Resident Evil, Silent Hill scared me and scarred me psychologically in a way Resident Evil could only dream of. I remember walking down my suburban alleyway at 12 years old, itching to rent the lone copy Mammoth Video had in stock. I was in luck. But it was as though my stomach knew something my mind didn't, because as I was heading back home, I had to take a massive dump. And so I ran the rest of the way back, desperately trying to keep my cheeks clenched together. The first 15 minutes were all it took. Silent Hill wasn't fun like Resident Evil, but something told my preteen brain that video games were beginning to grow up. In 2001, Silent Hill 2 released among a murderer's row of PlayStation 2 classics. If you were a teenager in 2001 and had parents that could afford a PlayStation 2, you were spoiled beyond belief. Konami and Capcom have had quite the rivalry spanning all the way back to the 1980s. No other third-party developers came close to reaching the same critical acclaim during the Nintendo and SNES era. Capcom had Mega Man, Street Fighter, and DuckTales, while Konami had Castlevania, Contra, and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles beat-em-ups. And then Konami just kept going, graduating from 2D platformers and giving us Tokimeki Memorial, but also Snatcher, Policenauts, and Metal Gear Solid. Konami had an auteur, Hideo Kojima, and then they let him go unceremoniously after releasing Metal Gear Solid V: The Phantom Pain, one of the most polarizing yet universally acclaimed video games of all time. Konami management had such a tight leash on the guy that they refused to allow him to attend his boys' award show. And in a rare moment of base behavior, Jeff Keighley sounded off on Konami after Kiefer Sutherland accepted the award on behalf of Kojima.
Hideo Kojima is not here with us tonight, and I want to tell you a little bit about that. Mr. Kojima had every intention of being with us tonight, but unfortunately he was informed by a lawyer representing Konami just recently that he would not be allowed to travel to tonight's awards ceremony to accept any awards. He's still under an employment contract, and it's disappointing, and it's inconceivable to me that an artist like Hideo would not be allowed to come here and celebrate.
Kojima had no connection to Silent Hill until he was given the reins to direct PT, which was released the same day it was revealed in August 2014. PT was a teaser demo designed to hype up the latest Silent Hill, simply called Silent Hills. It would star Walking Dead heartthrob Norman Reedus, and even Guillermo del Toro was going to be involved. But the game was soon cancelled by Konami, and if that wasn't ghoulish enough, the company removed PT from online stores, meaning it's nearly impossible to experience the game unless you downloaded it when it initially released. Del Toro was so frustrated by the experience that he vowed to never work with a video game publisher again. Kojima moved on, eventually forming a new studio with the backing of Sony. 2015 was the year that really showed Konami management's complete lack of care for their workers. They weren't even allowed health insurance, and any work you did for Konami could not be used in your resume if you decided to leave. How was it possible that a studio who funded so many classics were showing signs of cult-like behavior? Silent Hill has been a franchise for 25 years, but for most fans, the period that mattered most was 1995 to 2005. Team Silent, a small Japanese development team within Konami, developed the first 4 games in the series. Unbounded by Konami, Team Silent's youth and passion was responsible for creating some of the most artistic video games ever up to that point. After their disbandment, the series collapsed into mediocrity. We saw Silent Hill try to be translated onto handhelds, into pachinko machines, and into the next generation of consoles, all with pretty mixed results. And the franchise had been dormant in regards to new video games until 2024, its final release being 2012 Silent Hill Downpour for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. It was ironic then that a horror studio accused of making mid-games was going to be the one tasked with the burden of remaking Silent Hill 2, the most beloved game in the entire franchise. Bloober Team is the second most famous Polish game developer behind CD Projekt Red. While nowhere near as acclaimed or relevant as the team behind The Witcher and Cyberpunk 2077, Bloober Team's output has been divisive both with critics and with gamers. But while most of their games average out to mostly positive on Steam's community reviews, Western professional sites are much harsher towards the team. And they take some wild swings, admittedly. They made a Blair Witch game centered around a war veteran suffering PTSD. In 2021, Bloober released The Medium, an original IP that was a love letter to late 90s survival horror. It was an unholy fusion of fixed camera angles, stealth gameplay, and Quantic Dream narrative that starred an orphan in post-Soviet Poland. The game was dripping with oppressively creepy atmosphere, but lost a lot of folks with the slower gameplay and complete lack of combat. The Medium's themes were a pleasant surprise, but unfortunately were handled clumsily, at least to a good portion of people. A game centered around an orphan in a country that brutally transitioned from communism to free market shock therapy was definitely something I never played before. But equating Marianne's gift/curse to a mental illness that takes her life when she chooses to unalive herself made for sort of a cringe ending. And that's not to mention the infamous Richard storyline, in which the game tries to explain the root cause of abuse in a file who spends the middle portion of the game stalking you. This is just my take on it, but I think a lot of critics overreacted to the addition of Richard. I don't believe the game was trying to empathize with him, but rather show how abusers can also be immensely talented and sometimes even sensitive people. I mean, just look at Roman Polanski, arguably the most acclaimed Polish director. Disregarding that talent because they were a pedophile is simplifying and disavowing a complex and deeply serious issue. Monsters can be talented artists. That's not empathizing with a monster. That's highlighting how abuse is passed down from generation to generation. Bloober didn't have to worry about creating a story or a world for the Silent Hill 2 project, because luckily for them, the Silent Hill 2 remake came prepackaged with one of the most compelling stories and iconic soundtracks in gaming. James Sunderland is a man plagued with guilt after killing his wife. He returns to Silent Hill in order to remember why he killed her, and we the players are asked to judge whether James is justified or not in doing so. Silent Hill 1 made the town the star of the show. A cult runs everything and has kidnapped Harry Mason's daughter so she can give birth to a demonic entity that will bring about untold levels of destruction. Silent Hill 2 is a little more subtle and a more interesting tale for it. It's a very small cast, 5 people, 6 if you count Mary. There's Angela, a 19-year-old who is just as lost and hopeless as James. She's looking for her mom. She's ashamed when she refers to her as Mama in front of James. One side of the internet accused Bloober of being too woke when the decision was made to make Angela's chin and cheekbones the normal size for a young woman. This led to predictably cruel memes that greatly exaggerated the size of Angela's face. In the original, her face is slightly thinner. I think conservative daddy figure Jordan Peterson is at least partially to blame for this. Like, remember when he was saying how plus-size models shouldn't be allowed on the cover of Sports Illustrated swimsuit magazines? Don't get me wrong, Jordan Peterson isn't a total idiot. The stuff about cleaning your room and your mind before you can properly challenge the world is pretty good advice. But have you been cleaning your room, Jordan? Holding on to these archaic beliefs that should belong in the 1980s and the 1990s, like how women should look like frail and coked up supermodels? That's not some moral stance, that's just cringe. You brainwormed a lot of your parasocial children into actually believing that should be the case. And you want to talk about gluttony? How about being a selfish drug addict who just shamelessly gobbles up pain pills like they're candy? Glug, glug, glug. Angela refuses to accompany James despite his repeated attempts at joining up. They're both in hell together and yet on their own separate journeys through it. You meet Angela at the beginning of the game in a graveyard. There are no enemies yet, just a long and linear walk into the town. Silent Hill 2's first level is mostly outdoors. The abandoned suburbs prove to be both a peaceful and foreboding walk for James. A blend of picturesque scenery out of the Pacific Northwest and the Midwest sprawl of middle-class shops decaying with the passage of time. I don't know exactly what type of person Resident Evil is for, but I do know that Silent Hill is for quiet and depressed bitches. And I am proudly one of those quiet and depressed bitches. The Eastern Veil has opened up considerably since the original Silent Hill 2. James can now explore multiple smaller interiors that prime the player for the longer form ones ahead. Parked SUVs and trucks can now be vandalized for precious health and ammo. The original Silent Hill 2 wasn't a long game, especially once you knew what you were doing. The whole experience takes roughly 5 hours if you're well acquainted with the game, while Bloober's remake will take about 20 the first time around. The premium price tag of $70 is a concern in a time of increasing inflation. Open world design brainwormed us into believing a game with 100 hours of vapid and obligatory content justified its price. The Silent Hill 2 remake has the burden of justifying its longer length to earn that price tag. While the jury is still out regarding Resident Evil 4's status as a true survival horror game, the Silent Hill 2 remake now takes the length of the 2005 classic and is better off for it. The radio is one of Silent Hill's iconic inventory items. I still remember the reviews 25 years ago that thought the radio was an annoying and unnecessary addition because it blasts white noise every time an enemy is nearby. James has the option to turn it off, something a ton of reviewers implored the player to do. I don't think the radio is annoying, I think it's horrifying. You get plenty of quiet time in Silent Hill. The radio's purpose is to unsettle you. Consider the first time James encounters the most recognizable foe in the series, Pyramid Head. A steel gate separates him from you, and yet his motionless stare is enough to turn me into stone. Pyramid Head was an original design from Team Silent's artist-director Masahiro Ito. Faceless entities have been a staple of horror for decades. Just look at the masks of Michael Myers.
I met this 6-year-old child with this blank, pale, emotionless face and the blackest eyes, the devil's eyes.
He represented the dichotomies of pain and pleasure, of sex and death. Its sharp and angular features were meant to inspire a feeling of intense punishment, something James feels he deserves for the unforgivable sin of not only killing his wife, but for being a horny bachelor again after her death, or perhaps before. Ito got the idea for the sharp metallic angles from German tanks from World War II, so if Pyramid Head wasn't already horrific enough for you, just remember that he's also a fascist. But like all marketable commodities, Pyramid Head fell victim to Konami's lust for profit, becoming a focal point of 2 movies, an arcade game, and a recurring enemy in the franchise's later titles. Hell, he even makes a cameo appearance in 2024's Astrobot, a game marketed to children. Ito claims that every interpretation of Pyramid Head post-Silent Hill 2 is a misunderstanding, because Pyramid Head was only ever meant to be a manifestation for James's guilt. Fortunately for Bloober, this is a remake, and Pyramid Head is every bit as menacing as he initially was. The infamous sexual assault scene from the original is still here, but the most graphic details are now shielded from the player. James retreats in horror and confusion into a nearby closet, only able to helplessly watch the assault play out, like Kyle MacLachlan in David Lynch's Blue Velvet. I don't know entirely how to feel about this. I'm not surprised Bloober would preserve the scene. Like the medium, Silent Hill 2 is a game about problematic entities, and I'm not entirely sure where the line should be drawn. There's debate among Silent Hill fans arguing about whether or not what Pyramid Head does should be considered sexual assault or not. If we're to read this from James' perspective, I think two things become abundantly clear. One, it's a scene that does a hell of a job depicting James as a helpless man who can do nothing but watch his guilt and shame play out before him. And two, if Pyramid Head is a representation of his guilt, then it is entirely possible James has horrific unconscious thoughts that he can't control, like any man. This is the catch-22 of Pyramid Head. He's an iconic figure with a cool design, and because of that, fans will defend him. Michael Myers is a universally beloved serial killer in the Halloween franchise, but there is a producer's cut of the 6th movie in which he's forced to impregnate his sister in order to continue the Myers lineage. There are hardcore Halloween fans who either venomously hate this movie or will refuse to watch it, because to them, Michael Myers can only be properly admired when he's unaliving. Sexual assault is a bridge too far. This is fascinating to me because it kind of exposes the guilt and shame of fans of the series who will passionately defend Pyramid Head for never technically sexually assaulting Maria. He only repeatedly unalives her. But physical attraction is only one side to assault. It is also a power game, not just of masculinity, but of economic stability. Of course, Pyramid Head would never actually sexually assault Maria in James's fantasy, but a random leg monster he's routinely killed himself? It's a perfect example of working class trauma being fetishized in order to sustain a middle class man's fantasy, whether unconscious or not. And it is no accident that this scene occurs in a poverty-stricken apartment building in the outskirts of a middle-class vacation resort. We meet Eddie in the Woodhaven apartment complex, the game's second level. He's puking his guts out in one of the building's random rooms as a dead body rots in the kitchen. A body Eddie swears he has nothing to do with, but something about him is sus. The blue walls of the original apartment are replaced with putrid whites, its wallpaper peeling off at every angle. This apartment is a piece of shit, and yet Silent Hill is supposed to be this idyllic middle-class town in which to escape your mundane reality. But who lived here? Definitely not the middle class. We find both the flashlight and the handgun in the apartment. The flashlight is another toggle item that offers precious light in a notoriously dark game. But constantly flashing it means James is far more vulnerable to the demons who now stalk Silent Hill. In 2001 Silent Hill 2, the monsters were more indifferent to James's presence. They would certainly try to kill you if you tread heavily, but they functioned more as lost ghosts than active murder entities. In the remake, Bloober decided to make the monsters more aggressive. They are constantly lying in wait to ambush James. Silent Hill 2 is Bloober Team's first game with substantial combat. One of the medium's criticisms was that it was too boring. There were no guns or melee weapons. The first gameplay trailer hyping the remake showed off the combat more than the atmosphere or the story, the two things Silent Hill is most acclaimed for. Gunplay and blunt force hacking were never Silent Hill's forte. They were there, but they were never anything more than serviceable. The Silent Hill protagonists aren't cops after all. They're regular people enduring extraordinary circumstances. I never thought I'd say this, but the combat in the remake is the thing that sets it apart from the original, and mostly in a good way. It's astonishing to me that Bloober nailed the combat as well as they did because it is, 1, something they've never done to this extent before, and 2, it is never something I thought I needed in a Silent Hill video game. It is essentially the Resident Evil 2 remake system, but with the addition of brutal melee combat straight out of 2006's Condemned Criminal Origins. You feel the blunt force trauma every time James maniacally wallops a monster across the face with the steel pipe. The drawback, and it is a small one, is that the game can occasionally feel like it's becoming more of a predictable ride than a nerve-fraying psychological horror experience. But then, a little more than halfway through, we encounter the remade prison. I hardly remember the prison from OG Silent Hill 2. Not to say it's bad, but compared to the apartments, the hospital, and the hotel, the Toluca prison was a brief footnote. Bloober Team expands on it to such a degree that James is now like Leon and Claire in the RPD basement, but extended to a 2-hour dread session against countless imprisoned monsters. But they're not imprisoned for long. James must short-circuit an electric chair, but doing so unlocks all of the jail cells in Toluca. What follows is a white-knuckle endeavor that sends James and the player through cell blocks where he must grab key items and then either choose to hightail out of there or face every enemy head-on. It makes perfect sense that Toluca Prison is now the site of the most intense gameplay. The American prison system is the most symbolic example of the cruelty of the justice system, a system based on the laws of indifference, punishment, and fascism. There are light switches James can flip on for a meager few seconds, almost as if they're only there to taunt him into a false sense of security. The apartment and hospital have their own moments of insanity, but nothing compares to the total despair of James blindly plummeting down into the abyss. Angela has found herself here as well, but still refuses to tag along. James asks her if her mom lived in this crummy apartment building. She doesn't know, but she's upset that he knows she's from Silent Hill, as if it's some big secret. Angela does ask for a favor before they go their separate ways. She asks James to hold on to her knife because she doesn't know what she'll do if she hangs on to it. We never get to use the knife as a weapon, because it's not a weapon. It's an instrument of cowardice.
Please don't!
James also meets a young girl named Laura in the apartments. She's a brat to you, kicking away a key and continually taunting James, claiming he never loved Mary. Between the apartments and Brookhaven Hospital, James meets Maria at Rosewater Park, a place he was hoping to find his wife. She's a spitting image of Mary, except with blonde hair and pink tips. Despite his futile attempts at not showing it, James is sexually attracted to Maria. Not only because of her looks, but her vulnerability. She's bipolar, confident one minute, the next weak and insecure. Nietzsche described two types of morality, master and slave. Master morality belonged to the ancient Greeks, who emphasized excellence and a strong will, but at the expense of being naive. Slave morality, on the other hand, was based entirely off resentment of what the master had. It was an invention of the Christians, who were meek and humble in appearance, but became immensely powerful in their desire for revenge. A vicious mask for projected self-hate. James is cursed with both types of morality. He stupidly returns to Silent Hill because he's convinced himself he's received a letter from his dead wife, and he's going to do what he believes is noble, to fight monsters with the pride of a heroic video game protagonist in order to reunite with Mary and thus redeem himself. But on the other hand, he is racked with guilt and shame over what he did to his wife, so much so that he can't even bring himself to remember or accept what he did. Because of this, he torments himself. Silent Hill is so terrifying because James's guilt is exceptionally terrifying. It's like what Ito said, Pyramid Head is the conscious creation of James. He's willing to subject himself to this hell of existence in order to uncover what he did. Heaven's Night was originally a brief sojourn, a small sanctuary before the rest of the game. In the remake, Bloober has repurposed the strip club to be a prestige moment for both James and Maria. James asks if this is the special place Mary meant, but Heaven's Night is the last stop before Brookhaven Hospital. A hospital is where Mary died, after all. And well, it's where Maria dies as well. James asks Maria if he's crazy for thinking this is the place Mary meant. Maria pours both of them a drink behind the bar as James sits on the other side, the tan line on his ring finger showing.
Am I crazy? You know, for thinking she could be here.
Crazy is one word for it, I guess. I can think of another.
And what's that?
Hopeful.
But he doesn't have time for a drink or a break. Brookhaven is similar to the apartments at balancing the normal world and the other world, but both remain equal parts nightmare fuel James must navigate to find Laura. Maria rests in one of the examination rooms, leaving James to resume his heroic quest. You can choose to check on her, an instance which Bloober rewards the player with a touching scene where Maria acknowledges how sweet James is. But when we regroup with her in the nightmare version, she's scared and lonely. James was too busy fending off sexy demon nurses, and the nurses are some of the most daunting foes in the remake. They can cover a ton of ground real quick, and their knife swings do a ton of damage. Kneecapping them takes way too many shots with the handgun, so whenever I see one of them, I pull out the shotgun. After Maria's tragic death at the hands of Pyramid Head, the town goes dark. James must soldier on as the second half of Silent Hill 2 abandons any remaining strands of logic. The Historical Society is a museum showcasing Silent Hill's checkered past. The Brookhaven Hospital was built in the 1880s to combat a plague which allegedly emerged once immigrants began coming into the town. But most of the memos in the hospital indicate that it functioned more as a psychiatric asylum, with patients there against their will. Which begs the unsettling question, is the town of Silent Hill anti-Semitic? At any rate, James descends impossibly downward, first to Toluca Prison, and then the Labyrinth. A nowhere place with an empty map James must fill in as he goes. The Labyrinth has gone through some serious reconstruction since the 2001 OG Silent Hill 2. It is now divided into 3 sections: the rotten area, the desolate area, and the ruined area. Truly hopeful names. It was almost as if Bloober made Layers of Fear and Blair Witch as a testing ground to showcase their true visual strength. Their labyrinth is a sickening void of twisting nowhere spaces patrolled by demons who skitter under cold steel grates. James must formulate a game plan before entering these monoliths because it is extremely easy to get lost in them. I don't know if I'd call the labyrinth as terrifying as the prison, but it is somehow even more despairing in its utter hopelessness. The level kicks off with a bombastic boss fight against Angela's father, Thomas Orozco. According to a news article, Angela killed her father out of self-defense after he abused both her and Angela's mother. He's an alcoholic who appears before James as a creature organically attached to a door. It's putrid and gross. It's unclear whether Angela's section of the labyrinth is the Woodside Apartments, but it is just as desolate a hellhole. There's an empty living room, save for a lazy boy and a television where Thomas would sit and drink his miserable life away. Playing the labyrinth felt like playing a level inside my rotting and decaying tooth that was about to be extracted, but more on that in a bit. The end of the labyrinth contains the Eddie boss fight, just like in the original. It turns out that the man truly was sus all along. He's a murderous psychopath who has sublimated his years of abuse from others into his own destructive rage. It's the most difficult boss fight in the game up to this point, in my opinion, because Eddie constantly fucks with James. First by playing with the lights and then turning on the meat racks, constantly interrupting your senses. Also, he has a gun. The click of it before Eddie fires is an audio cue to dodge immediately. If you fail, you lose considerable health. The encounter has 3 stages, making it the longest fight in the game up until the final boss. Eddie is the only man James encounters in Silent Hill 2. He's a delinquent who's been entirely rejected by normal society, destined to a life of intense self-hatred. Like Angela, he was never able to overcome his abuse, so he turned to the only thing he knew how to give: cruelty.
Help, Eddie.
Angela's trauma warped her perception so severely to the point she's constantly surrounded by fire. In her final scene, James refuses to return the knife, but it doesn't matter. Angela has already made her decision. She walks up the stairs and into the flames as James acknowledges that her reality is hotter than hell. Angela doesn't visualize demons to viciously bludgeon like James, but what she does see and feel is just as punishing. And unlike James, Angela's a victim to a system that perpetuates abuse by rehabilitating innocent people and ignoring children with cruel parents who suffered their own cruelty. Honestly, it reminds me of Richard from The Medium. I don't feel bad for Richard, nor do I feel bad for Angela's deadbeat father. Are they victims for suffering abuse? I don't know, but I do know that evil hides in the belief that you are inherently good. It takes the death of Eddie for James to teleport out of the labyrinth and return back to Silent Hill proper, to the game's final level, the Lakeview Hotel. Is this the special place Mary was referring to? The main beats of the hotel are left relatively the same, except the employees-only area where James must venture completely unarmed is now somehow even more oppressive. And we're talking completely naked here. No guns, no pipe, no radio, no health drinks, and no flashlight. In the OG, this section had common enemy types that could be easily avoided. Bloober has added hulking brutes who patrol the hallways and kept the common enemies for the smaller rooms. If you just stay out of the hallways and chill, you should be fine. The brutes can't get into smaller spaces. It's here James finds the key that allows him to gain access to room 312, where CRT television and VCR await. James learns the bitter truth that he's repressed, and we're transitioned to the other world of the hotel. Duality is a concept the Silent Hill series has always played with to varying degrees of success. It's a theme prevalent in the works of David Lynch, the binaries of good and evil, or light and darkness, or more complexly, the idyllic suburban Americana and its underbelly of resentment and hypocrisy. Woodbridge, Brookhaven, and Lakeview all shapeshift into an otherworldly hell as James crosses from one reality into another. But I'm not entirely sure if Duality has anything to do with Maria and Mary. Gene Park's 3 stars out of 4 review of the Silent Hill 2 remake writes, quote, Silent Hill 2 in 2001 opened with a close-up shot of James Sunderland staring at a reflection, deep into his sunken eyes. It was important for the audience to see his face. In the 2024 remake, there's a shift in perspective to show his hands first. Today we are meant to see through his eyes, not into them, end quote. Both games begin with James looking into a mirror. We can never truly know what's real and what isn't in Silent Hill because this is his story. And as much as I love the 2001 Silent Hill 2, it feels more like a game about James than the player. But having played Bloober's remake, I've considered something I've never once considered in the 23 years I've known this game. What if Maria is real?
Remember that time in the hotel?
There are 8 endings in the Silent Hill 2 remake, some of which are fun Easter eggs like the alien and dog endings. I got the leave ending on my first playthrough. Maria isn't involved in this ending, at all. Instead, James heroically accepts what he's done, and Mary pretty much just lets him off the hook, apologizing for her sickness and for being a burden. Even though it is entirely possible she's right when she states in the letter that James was disgusted by her. 3 years is a long time. But Mary hasn't been dead for 3 years. She had up to 3 years to live with her cancer diagnosis. The hospital kept her alive longer in order to study her illness, which the game never explains just how the Sunderlands were able to afford this type of treatment. James's occupation is never disclosed, but again, it is implied he is well off financially. In the Maria ending, James isn't let off the hook. Mary calls him out for lying, for possibly being a cheat. Maria dies 3 times in Silent Hill 2. Once in Brookhaven Hospital, once in the Labyrinth, and once before the final encounter with the 2 Pyramid Heads. I interpret this 2 different ways. 1, the 3 deaths symbolize James's tremendous guilt over killing Mary. It's a deeply Catholic reading, 3 being the number of the Holy Trinity. James has sinned and must redeem himself as a man who abandoned his wife. but also as a man who nobly resisted the advances of a blonde seductress who looked just like Mary. But let's be real here. If I were to conduct a poll right now, asking cis hetero men if they found Mary or Maria hotter, where do you think that percentage would skew? So Pyramid Head kills Maria twice, but in the Labyrinth, she dies waiting for James in a prison cell. Remember who was waiting on the other side of the steel bars in the apartment at the beginning of the game? The second interpretation doesn't let James off the hook so easily, because Maria dying 3 times could also mean James not only abandoned his dying wife, but had an affair in Silent Hill with Maria. And this is where I believe Bloober was the perfect team to preserve Silent Hill 2. Solaris was originally a Polish book that was adapted into a movie by Soviet director Andrzej Tarkovsky. In the movie, a researcher named Chris must go to the planet Solaris in order to find out what happened to the crew there. Solaris is a sentient, conscious entity that can manifest humanity's deepest insecurities, like Silent Hill. When Chris arrives, he hallucinates his dead wife, Hari, of 10 years. But she insists she's real, and who are we to doubt her? Their marriage fell apart when he took an assignment in another town. Hari stayed behind and died soon after. The Solaris version of Hari asks Chris if he always thought about her. He hesitates before answering, no. I don't take this to mean he wasn't literally thinking about her every single solitary moment of his life. That would be obsessive and insane. Instead, this is his confession that he was literally unfaithful to her. If a Western studio remade this game, I have very little doubt they would have fucked with the story, changed plot beats. But Silent Hill 2 as a work of fiction was already as close to perfect as a video game lover could ever hope for. In the Maria ending, James doesn't read Mary's letter, and instead of leaving with Laura, he leaves with Maria, who coughs. You better do something about that cough, James says, with vague annoyance. His cycle of hell will only continue in this ending. Mary's letter was always addressed to Laura, who became a friend of Mary's at the hospital. My personal theory is Laura is a ghost who had terminal cancer like Mary, and that's how they met. So who is Maria then? A copy of Mary? Or could it be 2 different stereotypes of women James has made up in his own head? One a middle-class and meek, humble servant, the other a working-class stripper who has her own insecurities of abandonment. I take Heaven's Night quite literally to be the place James met Maria. In astrology, the number 3 represents support. James completely failed Mary as a faithful and devout husband. He abandoned her when things got too hard. As of this recording, I am a 37-year-old who has been married for 3 years to someone who is, as of this recording, 3 months pregnant. When I first played Silent Hill 2 23 years ago, I never dreamed it would scare me the way the remake could in 2024. As a husband, as a soon-to-be father, and as a man. The day after I beat the Silent Hill 2 remake, I had to get one of my molars extracted. In regards to IRL terrifying moments, this is easily in my top 10. Driving there alone, subjecting myself to 2 strangers who did a remarkable job in doing what they did, but I was literally shaking in cold sweat this entire experience. The tooth could have been saved had I been going to the dentist regularly, but the worse the pain got, the more shameful I was about it. It was a dead and rotting tooth tucked away where no one could ever see, but I could feel it dying and decaying inside of me. Maybe I'm being too hard on the leave ending. Maybe Mary is being real with James. And I do love this ending because it shows that James, despite his cowardice and selfishness, now understands what it means to be faithful. And that path is going to feel lonely quite often. You're born into this world alone, and you die in this world alone. But in between, you have the support of others, if you allow yourself the grace to just let them in. In Letterboxd reviewer Matt Lynch's 9 out of 10 review of Solaris, he writes, quote, Whether an intelligent alien planet or the woman you married and loved, another being is ultimately and fundamentally unknowable to you." End quote. We can never know for sure if what we experience in Silent Hill 2 is just James's interpretation of these women instead of their actual ones. This is an incredible subversion of trauma from the male perspective. Usually we hear about women's trauma, and we ask ourselves what can be believed and what can't. But James is an unreliable narrator. Various memos in the game indicate he was an alcoholic, and yet James doesn't drink once in the events of the game. He gets defensive when Maria offers him a drink. He uses a 6-pack of soda pop instead of a 6-pack of beer during the garbage chute puzzle. Love isn't a feeling. We can't predict the future. Silent Hill 2 is a game that can be enjoyed by all, but it asks a terrifying thing from men: to be faithful to the end, to be loyal to the end. These are words, and men have proven remarkably adept at saying beautiful and reassuring things. But love, faith, and loyalty require constant care and attention. Love is an action. It's the scariest thing you can do. The Silent Hill 2 remake has been an unmitigated success story for Bloober. The game has already sold over 1 million copies, and they're already flexing their next project, an original IP called Chronos: The New Dawn. Bloober Team is in their GigaChat arc, and there are still going to be the outliers, like the survival horror purists who roll their eyes at third-person over-the-shoulder combat, and the ones who think the fog is used as an excuse to maintain the frame rate. Like, dude, the fog is in less than 20% of the entire game. The fog is iconic. Quiet and depressed bitches love the fog. And these aren't even the people who were bitching about Bloober being too woke. These were people who thought Bloober made cringe and mediocre games. All these people had convinced me I wouldn't like the Silent Hill 2 remake. But like Tim Rogers says, I'm done with people telling me not to have a good time. Thanks for watching.
Looking for someone.
Silent Hill? You promised you'd take me there again someday. Well, I'm alone there now. In our special place. Waiting for you.
Mary? Anyway, I'm glad you're alive.
Anyway? What do you mean, anyway? I was almost killed back there. I have never been so scared in my whole life.
Silent Hill 2 Remake is another victim of pandering to the modern audience. What is the modern audience exactly? Not gamers. Activists.
Don't tell me that they are an anchor studio in our reality and that there's a Bloober Team in every fucking reality and that they eventually do all horror remakes in all realities.
Maria? Maria! I thought that thing killed you. Are you hurt?
Not at all, silly. I'm not your Mary. This whole area used to be a sacred place. I think I can see why.
I killed her.
Are you afraid?
So I don't really care if it's dangerous or not. I'm going either way.